With that, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the session that we all have been really waiting for. I mean, this session is actually on public demand because everybody is really looking forward to hear from our very own Sraddhalu ji. Shri Sraddhalu Ranade ji is here. So all the people who are still waiting outside, this announcement is for all of you to please come inside because we are about to begin the last session of this Shakti Health Conclave. And we can't be more than happy to be with our very own Shri Sraddhalu Ranade ji. Thank you so much. Over to you, please.
In the discussion yesterday, I had raised a question in passing, which in my opinion was perhaps the single most important for the future of humanity. And the question I had asked was, how did those people in the past, a few thousand years ago perhaps, know that this complex, accessible process would lead to such radical results, which today, with very advanced technologies, including genetics and knowledge built up over a couple of centuries using highly technical means, is able to not only confirm but even perhaps build upon. How did they get to that knowledge? This is so important because you find the same question could be asked about very simple Ayurvedic medicines. We have, for example, Triphala, which is a mix of 3 different kinds of, fruit, phala, which in combination is able to even reverse or substantially affect some of the most extreme forms of cancer. These are published papers. In that specific proportion, take out any one of them, modify those proportions, and you don't get the same results. How would somebody ever come up with this discovery of an exact proportion with these 3 materials? And the common answer which is given to you by the conventional allopathic researchers today or within the Western framework, which is a bottom-up framework, would be, oh, they kept trying over thousands of years and discovered something that works. There's no such evidence of anybody trying with a hit and run. They had it, they declared it, it worked, that was it. You see this capacity in certain traditions even today. Sometimes there are people who live very close to nature. They have as if access to knowledge of the plants spontaneously. And we could say a kind of an intuitive knowledge, intuitive access. Such would be the means by which those ancients discovered many of these things. So to me, this is the single most important question because it determines our future potential as human beings, as a species, not just in the medical field, but in every field. If we can access that kind of a knowledge, we can enormously accelerate all our discoveries, all new technologies, and with the means that we have today, which are far more refined, far more precise, which can penetrate into matter, into our genetics, and we can observe live, literally, processes of biology at a cellular level. With that access of knowledge and this technology, imagine what would be possible. And this will determine our future. So, in having given this as a broad background, my second question from there was, well, how could we access that? And so, rather than answering this question directly, I'm going to share a framework, which is the yoga framework, of what we are constituted of and our relationship with the world, and particularly from the perspective of health and healing, which has been the broad sense of this conference. And although for many of you this would be something quite familiar, but perhaps I would be able to add a few dimensions which might be helpful and of practical implication, since many of us are already as therapists or sometimes even as patients. You see, one of the great discoveries of modern physics is that all matter is essentially energy. It is an enormous breakthrough, the mass energy equivalence. But then the question comes from there inevitably, if every single particle of matter is essentially the same one energy, what makes that energy become an electron or a proton or a neutron and stay electron or proton or neutron? What is that mechanism? And science does not even bother to question that. But when you question that, you discover that all matter is energy, but behind energy is one more reality, which is what the yoga tradition tells you, is consciousness. Consciousness shapes energy. Consciousness drives energy. Consciousness holds energy in a mold of an intention, of a thought form, which then becomes matter. So if all matter is energy, all energy is driven and guided by an underlying innate consciousness. If we come to this conclusion, and this is easy to validate, and much of quantum physics actually is a struggle to discover how consciousness interacts with this energy. But without a proper framework of understanding, they're a bit lost. But with this framework, of course, there are implications, and one of the implications being we ourselves being essentially also in mind and awareness, consciousness. Are we able to tap into that underlying consciousness of matter and shape it from inside out? And if we can we develop this capacity to be able to shape that actively, directly, bypassing external processes? This, of course, is what we see in so many of the yoga traditions and so many stories that we hear of yogis. One of the most famous and interesting for me is one of Ganapati Muni. Those of you who might have heard his name, he was the one who declared Ramana Maharshi as Maharshi and named him such. He used to often visit certain families when he was during his intense tapasya to stay with them. They would look after him and he would go back. And as a way of giving back, he would borrow from them a 1 anna coin in those days. This is nearly 100 years ago. Hold it in his hand, and he would sit with the children and narrate to them some stories. That was his way of sharing with the family. At the end of the story narration, he would give back the coin and it had been transmuted into gold. Just that intense pressure of consciousness with an intention, changing an atomic structure. We have many examples of such things in traditions across the world. Science cannot explain and therefore simply refuses to engage with such phenomena. But if you have a framework which is fully aligned with current physics, yet extends it, then we have a framework within which we can actually validate the phenomena and perhaps replicate. And this has implications for what we are doing, especially in the medical field. Because now we realize this 3-layer model, consciousness, energy, and matter, is actually how we are constituted. In the yoga tradition, you're familiar, we speak of 3 bodies. There is the physical body, Annamaya, the life force body, which is Pranamaya, and the mind body, which is the Manomaya. 3 sheaths, as it is called. They're sheaths because they encase the true person that you are as the soul within. But as 3 sheaths, they're substantial, they're independent, and one can actually validate their independence, subjectively as well as objectively. Quite a bit of the recent researchers involving what they call bioenergy and biofield research is tapping into the life force, pranamaya, as it binds itself into the physical body. So the Kirlian aura, which is measured, which is used for diagnosis, where problems of health are reflected in the shaping of this biofield or energy field and can be detected before even you fall sick, physically, externally, symptomatically. We find there also an extraordinary example. You take a fresh leaf and cut a part of it and take the Kirlian photograph. You get the complete bioenergy field of the leaf, including the part that has been cut off, showing you that there is a layer which is energetic, which interacts with electricity and high voltage, and yet which is independent of the physical part that has been cut off. It is as if a template for the physical leaf. When the physical leaf is damaged, it is this energy field which becomes the basis for the biological processes to form and rebuild themselves. If you take the human body, let's say you have a little cut in your hand, and if you look at a cellular level, the cells being separated and having died on both sides, when the rebuilding starts, how does the body cell on one side know which direction to grow, and how does the cell on the other side know which direction to grow until they rejoin? This cannot be explained unless there is some kind of an underlying framework, field, electric field, energy field, magnetic field, biofield, name is irrelevant, along which the cells grow, which guide the cellular growth, and which are independent of the physical damage. And this is the nature of this second body that we have, and especially a grade of it which is infused in the physical part, which you can actually feel when you bring your hands together quite close and you move slightly back and forth, you feel a sensation of a contact. It has a material density. You feel it as a substantial pressure at a distance of about 1 or 2 centimeters. You can see it sometimes around the head. Can you see that around the head like a haze? Most of you would be able to do that. And it's interestingly, it is elastic substance. You can, for example, grab it like this, and if you watch the space between the hand and the head, you will see like a rubber band stretching out. Can you see that? Anybody see it? You see that? Okay. You saw? Who saw that? Yes, you saw that? Okay. You can sense, it's as if the air is brighter in this space in between. Try it yourself, and you need, especially if the background is a bit blank, clear, it's easier to see. But the point is, it has a materiality. It can then be shaped, it can be modified, it can be directed. It also becomes the basis of so many psychic phenomena where you move an object. When they say they moved an object with the mind, no, it's not with the mind, it's actually with the substance which is projected out from your fingers or your hand or wherever, and of sufficient material density that it can actually move objects. And the training for this is actually simple. With a little bit of effort, within a day or two, you can easily move some very simple objects. But here is a framework in which you can understand all this phenomena and validate. And it does not contradict the current physical science. It adds, it extends, it makes complete. But the third body is the mental body. This mental body then is the basis, forms the template of the energetic field. If in the mental body you have a strong idea, strong form, strong sense of tension, knot, distortion, perversion, naturally it reflects in a distortion in the energy field, which eventually reflects in a distortion in the physical body. And you may correct all you want on the physical level, including cut out tissue, which represents a knot or a distortion. The distortion on the energy level will tend to reform on a biological level and replicate itself, unless you dissolve it at its origin. And so we understand also why certain kinds of illnesses tend to recur with no apparent biological basis left, but also how a psychological intervention can heal a biological illness. And then we can change our strategy of intervention to tap into all three layers, recognizing that there is an interconnection between them, an interdependence and an influence. We can address all three layers at the same time to have the most dramatic and perhaps lasting cure. So, for many of you, this would be something quite common, but it needs to be articulated in a way that we can also put into practice consciously. A lot of this is also validable by objective means. And I want to share with you a few stories, examples of actual research done by Dabur Research Foundation. And during a visit which Sanjay ji had organized, we had an interaction with some of their scientists. And a group of healers from the United States had approached them and wanted them to validate their healing protocols. So the system was set up. They were given certain samples to be studied in vitro, in vivo, and the papers have been published, I understand, subsequently. But one of the quite remarkable examples that they were giving was, in one case, the healer was in the United States and for some reason could not come. So he said, don't worry, I will transfer the healing through Skype call on your laptop. So these scientists were obviously disconcerted. But the sample which had to be healed was placed in front of a laptop, and on the screen was this person's image on a video call. He's seeing the sample. Sample is exposed to a laptop. What's the link between this laptop and the person over there? There's no physical link. There's not even an electromagnetic link which is direct. It's data which is being converted, multiplexed, bounced across satellites. The link is of data, which is something so abstract. And there is a transmission of an energy infused into this sample. And then there's a double-blind test. These samples were then applied upon different samples of cells and then the results seen. One of the examples that the lady gave, one of the scientists there gave us, she said it was her job to observe through the microscope the growth of cells. And with these two samples, one which had been infused with energy, the other which had not. And to them it was obvious. They would infuse the sample, look through the microscope, and in this case she said it was brain cells, nerve cells. And as she is watching, within 2 minutes of being exposed to the healing energy, the connections between the neurons began to grow, new connections within 2 minutes. And I want to highlight this for a very important reason. Your nerve cells, of course, being also the physical representatives of conscious intention and mind consciousness, are often the most plastic, the most responsive to intention. But in this case, energy directed from across the world on that substance. Initially, the energy is contained in a liquid. The liquid is transferred on the sample here. But at the moment it's transferred, the result begins on such a dramatic scale. New connections begin to form within 2 minutes. Now, my practical implication for this is your body's nerve cells. Think about what that means. Your body's nerve cells are constantly being bathed by your thoughts, your emotions, your energies. What are they doing to your body's nerve cells? Do you need somebody across the world to send a beam of energy? Can you not yourself redirect your own consciousness, your own energy, your own intention upon your own cells? Or, to put it another way, isn't your current illness the result of your thoughts and emotions and their influences on your biology? And if you choose to change this state of consciousness, within 2 minutes, the nerve cells can begin to change. Or given enough time, a few days or a few weeks, all cells can begin to change. And these are extraordinary implications, but backed by an evidence, backed by a framework of knowledge which can be validated. But the implications are so powerful. What we believe ourselves to be, the way we think, the way we feel is in fact the most powerful influence on our body's working. It changes the template which modifies the working of the cells from intention through energy into form of matter. There are many other implications, but I think this is where I want to pause. I want to share one more example which comes from another project of a very different kind, because all this we're discussing still at a very individual level. There's a project which is going on in the United States in Princeton University, which is called the Global Consciousness Project. The website is noosphere, noosphere.princeton.edu. This project has about, the last I had seen, some 65 computers scattered all over the world, at least 2 of them being in India. And in each of these computers, there's a little card plugged in with a small circuit, a computer chip, which is measuring the vibration of a single atom and converting the vibration into pulses. Effectively, for all practical purposes, it's a random vibration, and you get random pulses. These pulses are measured, recorded, and collated in a central computer at Princeton, on which data coming from 64 streams, 65 streams across the world, they do a statistical analysis to measure the overall degree of cohesiveness of the randomness or the spread of randomness across these pulses. So effectively, you get a graph. The graph rises when all the streams become more cohesive. The measure, mathematical count, rises. When they all become more random, the graph falls. So here's one single graph, mathematically calculated, drawn from random vibrations of atoms scattered around the world. What we see obviously in the graph is, it is mostly random. It rises and falls seemingly randomly. Except Every now and then, it seems to rise and stay up for a long time and then come down again. And the protocol which is followed, they go it the reverse way. They look at an event and then look for the graph changing to match the event. So every time that there is some event in which a large number of human minds are aligned to a common interest, the graph rises. For example, World Cup football, 1 billion people watching a live broadcast of the football. At the moment when somebody is going and about to kick the goal, there's high tension in a billion minds, the graph tends to go up. And in the next moment, the ball is shot, hit or missed, the graph falls because the tension is gone. There was an event about 20 years ago when in the Bay of Bengal, there was this sea quake and a tsunami, and about 150,000 people died. The suffering of the 150,000 people dying did not register on the graph. But within an hour or two, when the information hit the television screens of millions of people watching the damage, watching the suffering, that's when the graph began to go up. Interesting. And then it tended to stay up during the time when this messaging was strong. So there are many other examples of this kind, wherever a large number of minds are gathered in a single thing. So when there are certain groups which do meditation on specific dates, a full moon day, etc., you find again the graph going. And often these have local effects, not always global. Perhaps the suffering was brief. The question is, why didn't it register the suffering of the people who died? Perhaps it was brief, or perhaps from the point they died, the influence on the material atoms would have been much less. If they were in the body suffering in large numbers, perhaps that would have been registered, because it was a sudden death for most of them. But there is an interesting angle to this. Every New Year's Eve, in the 10 seconds before midnight, you have millions of parties, and everybody is doing a countdown. That's when the graph goes up. And the moment it hits midnight, people fall into chaos, the graph falls. But what is interesting is the graph goes up in the various time zones according to the time zones sweeping across the earth. Fascinating. So we see here evidence of the collective influence of the collective mind on what? Physical atoms and their vibrations. The implications are extraordinary. Because we are measuring a few atoms, which we picked at random, isn't it? But in fact, all atoms are being affected. That means just now, while all of us are aligned in a single idea, our minds are unified in a single intention, there is a shift in the atoms' vibrations in the entire hall, falling in alignment, less random. And from the moment we scatter, again they fall back into their normal routine. This is measurable. Even in a local space, you can put many of these sensors. These are called random number generators. You can measure these locally. Implications for the weather, implications for earthquakes. If in a space people are highly aligned in consciousness terms collectively, the tendency for randomness of atomic vibrations being less, the damage from earthquakes, the damage from storms might be less perhaps. Isn't it? But I'll give you one more example, which is mind-blowing. Can you guess, the experiment itself is going on now nearly 30 years. Can you guess in the last 30 years or so, which would be the one event which had the maximum impact on the graph rising? Anybody? What is the event which hit humanity hardest on a collective level in the media? I don't have data on COVID. Perhaps, yeah, I don't know about the data of COVID. But before that, 9/11. The September 11th attack, when planes rammed into those towers, every single television on in every channel on the entire planet was showing the same images again and again for the 3 days. What is fascinating is the graph went up the highest at 9/11 and took 3 days to come down. And if you remember that event, for those 3 days there was a sense of collective humanity against the stupidity and perversion of terrorism. And after 3 days, that connection broke. But the graph showed that the connection stayed up 3 days. But well, that's not the part which is dramatic. What is most dramatic is 9 hours before the attack took place, the graph had begun to rise. How do you explain this? The scientists operating the experiment do not explain it. They don't know what it means. But from a yoga point of view, remember we have subtle bodies? These subtle bodies, being necessarily free of the biological limits, are able to sense impending events because they already begin to act on those levels. Before I meet you, our intention to meet is already creating energetic connections and thought connections on those gradations, which are independent domains of experience.
What is the evidence of that?
I'm coming to that. That means before we meet, we already get a sense of each other by a contact on a higher level. Before any event happens on the physical plane, the energetic gridlock of those events becoming inevitable is already reflected in the energy field. So on the collective energy field of humanity, the event which was about to happen, which was going to shock us, was already sensed in the collective body. 9/11 attack was already inevitable on the energetic level. We were sensing it and bracing for it subconsciously, subliminally. You see the importance of this. This is true not only individually, it's true collectively. Before something happens to shock you suddenly, you sense it. Many times you might have felt this, sometimes in dream state, you hear a loud sound and you wake up. And if you're careful, you will find yourself waking up before you hear the sound. It's as if you sensed something was going to shock you and you began to brace for it individually. But collectively, as a species, we braced ourselves for the shock. And this was registered by this machine. Fascinating. The implications are enormous that we live not only as individuals, we also have a collective life where we influence each other profoundly on levels that we are not conscious of, but which impact the whole of humanity. One of the very interesting elements of this experiment is the question asked, over the last 30 years, has this unity of humanity increased or reduced? And then you can do a mathematical analysis on the numbers. We find the trend line overall is upward, meaning we're growing to become more and more unified as a humanity. Okay? So I'm going to conclude with one obvious implication. Well, not so obvious, but most important implication. If all our thoughts, all our emotions collectively are impacting all the atoms around us, which is the one part of the physical earth that you are impacting the most? Your own body. Wherever you go, even if you escape your problems and go on holiday, you're carrying your mind and emotions with your body, isn't it? At every moment, the state of your mind and emotions and its internal harmony or disharmony is impacting the vibrations of your physical atoms of the biology, naturally the working of the cells. Although this experiment doesn't touch the cells, but you can see the implication. And therefore, we form our physical, biological reality, harmony or disharmony. We are the creators in most cases. Of course, there are other interactions, but in most cases, we are the creators in the way we react to our circumstances, forming our own, so to say, destiny at a physical level. By changing our consciousness, there is a ripple effect all the way to the material level of our biology, but when collectively done, there's a ripple effect on physical circumstances. So I will leave you with this message. In case there are, do we have a moment for questions or? Okay. Anybody would have? Yes.
This is like all available on research. Is there a book that you would advise that we can read about?
For this particular example?
No, it's like
Yes.
so intensely amazing that I'm like, my mind is blown.
Yes, it is. Because we don't put it in these terms. The researchers who work on this global consciousness project would not dare to state it in these terms. They give you their data, you will see their papers published, but the implications is what we have to look at, isn't it? And it is. There are many books which deal with these things. So the graph started rising 9 hours before. The question now is, how do you explain this? They don't have an explanation. What we do have is a rationale, a framework which I described earlier, which does give you an explanation. Absolutely. The graph itself is published. The data is available. You can download it and do your own mathematical analysis. The whole project is completely open source. you can verify, validate everything. They've published their own papers showing the graph. It's one of the most dramatic of their experimental results. Incidentally, yes, I do know of people who have trained themselves to be able to move objects. But it's not by mind, it's by directing the substance of your physical body. And once you get the hang of that, it's easy to do. And there are actually people who teach this. I think in the Qigong tradition, they teach you also to do these things. It's not so difficult. But you have to understand, it's not mind moving, it's physical substance. Subtle physical substance that mind directs. Mind is your creator. It's your most powerful tool to reshape your body even.
So the graph can also show the consciousness of those terrorists who were planning it probably 9 hours prior. So this is the reason it started rising up, and as
a few individuals would not make such a large shift on the graph. The large shift is a measure of something across the earth.
All right.
Isn't it? So yes, when there are earthquakes in a specific region and the news is limited to that region, then you find the graph is changing only in that region, but not globally. But in this case, this was a global measure. The book I was suggesting is titled The Hidden Forces of Life. It's a compilation from the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. You'll find many other books of this kind which deal with these questions. The implications, again, to remind ourselves, your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, create your destiny, affect the physical body, affect the collective consciousness. And the more we become conscious, the more we are able to master our thoughts and our emotions, the more we can impact ourselves and our environment on all these levels. Sri Krishna put it in these terms in the Bhagavad Gita. He says, in order to become master of your circumstances, you become master of yourself. And the more you become master of yourself, the more you can impact your circumstances as a master of circumstance. Namaste.